They built empires, raised marble temples, and spoke of law and honor. But behind the columns of ancient Rome was a world far more carnal than we were ever taught. In this society obsessed with conquest, sex wasn't about romance or desire. It was about power, domination, control. And it wasn't hidden. It was etched into the stone, whispered in the forums, and performed in public shadows. What happened behind Roman doors and sometimes right in the open would scandalize even the darkest corners of today's world. But in Rome, it was just Tuesday. In ancient Rome, sex was never seen as private or sacred. It was political, it was weaponized, and it followed one rule: the penetrator ruled. Whether in the streets, the Senate, or the bedroom, Roman masculinity was defined by dominance, and sex became a battlefield. A free man could sleep with women, boys, slaves, even other men, as long as he was the one doing the taking. Submission, on the other hand, was weakness. It didn't matter if you were male or female; to be on the receiving end marked you as effeminate, inferior, or enslaved. And that was dangerous in a culture where social rank was everything. Roman society didn't divide sex by gender but by status. A senator who took a slave boy to bed might be praised. But that same senator being caught in a submissive role, that could ruin him. Even accusations could be lethal. Poets like Martial and Juvenal weaponized rumors in their verses, mocking enemies by painting them as passive lovers. These weren't casual jokes, they were social death sentences. Even the language itself was violent. Terms for sex carried undertones of conquest, violation, and ownership. To dominate in bed was to dominate in life. Roman men were expected to be conquerors in every sense. But beneath this obsession with control was a truth even they tried to hide: the fear of being dominated. This fear shaped law, policy, and punishment. Enslaved people had no sexual rights. Their bodies were tools, property, extensions of their master's ego. Consent was irrelevant, and the law didn't blink. As long as the Roman citizen played the role of penetrator, everything else was permissible. Sex wasn't about connection, it was performance, political theater, an affirmation of Roman superiority in all things, even in the act of pleasure. And yet, in a society obsessed with image, those who enforced these roles most violently were often the ones hiding their own contradictions. Behind the marble masks of Roman statues were people terrified of being seen as vulnerable, soft, or receptive. So they built a world where power could only be proven one way: through control, conquest, and the bodies of others. In Rome, to love was to dominate. Anything else was un-Roman. In ancient Rome, a woman's worth could be measured by something she didn't even control: her virginity. And for families obsessed with honor, bloodlines, and dowries, this purity wasn't just symbolic. It had a price, a ritual, and sometimes even an audience. Roman brides were expected to be untouched, and proof of that untouched state wasn't left to faith. It was verified, sometimes publicly, sometimes violently. The wedding night was more than a private union. It was a performance with legal and social consequences. Families would wait outside the bridal chamber, listening for signs of consummation. Some even demanded blood-stained sheets to be presented as evidence. If there was no blood, suspicion followed, whispers, accusations. In some cases, the marriage could be annulled, the bride shamed, the contract broken. But what they didn't say out loud was this: not all first times bled. Not all wounds were visible, and not all women were given a choice. Girls as young as 12 were married off, their bodies handed over as proof of political or financial alliance. These weren't unions of love, they were transactions. The man got property and access. The girl was expected to bear heirs quickly, quietly, and without complaint. And if she failed, if she didn't bleed, some were examined by midwives or older women. Others were sent back to their families, branded as damaged goods. And yet, the same society that prized virginity also mocked it. In literature and theater, virgins were often portrayed as naive, hysterical, or disposable. They were either to be protected obsessively or taken without consequence. Men bragged about stealing virginities in taverns, temples, and poems. It was the ultimate conquest, not just of a body, but of a name, a family, a future. The most extreme example was the Vestal Virgins. Chosen before puberty, these girls vowed 30 years of absolute chastity in service to the goddess Vesta. They were sacred, untouchable, symbols of Rome's moral center. But if one broke her vow or was suspected of breaking it, the punishment was death. Not by fire, not by sword. They were buried alive, with only a candle, a crust of bread, and the silence of the gods. That's how seriously Rome took a woman's untouched state. The virginity wasn't just hers, it was Rome's. And yet, beneath all the rituals and obsessions, there was fear, the fear of bloodlines tainted, of heirs born from another man, of women choosing instead of obeying. So they built cages from expectations, called them traditions, and buried the girls who slipped through the bars. In ancient Rome, the loss of virginity wasn't a private milestone. It was a spectacle and sometimes a sentence. Adultery in ancient Rome wasn't just a scandal, it was a legal crime. But only if you were a woman. A Roman man could sleep with mistresses, slaves, prostitutes, and even young boys, and no one would raise an eyebrow. But if a married woman strayed, even once, the punishment was swift, humiliating, and often irreversible. It was not about morality, it was about ownership. Wives were expected to be loyal, silent, and obedient. Not because of love, but because they were considered part of a man's property, just like his land, slaves, or livestock. If she cheated, it was seen as theft. Another man had trespassed on what was not his, and that violation, in the Roman mind, had to be punished not just privately, but publicly. Husbands could legally kill their wives' lovers if caught in the act. Some even dragged the woman through the streets with shaved heads and torn clothes, announcing her shame to neighbors and strangers alike. Fathers could take back their disgraced daughters, strip them of dowries, and confine them or disown them. Adulteresses were sometimes exiled to distant islands, forbidden from remarrying, branded socially unclean. But the hypocrisy ran deep. While a woman's fidelity was policed with violence, a man's was celebrated with laughter. Senators openly kept concubines, emperors flaunted their lovers. Even the law itself was written to protect male freedom and female silence. The Lex Julia, introduced by Augustus, claimed to uphold public morality by punishing adultery, but in truth, it only tightened control over women's bodies. Men could accuse their wives with little evidence, especially if the accusation served political revenge or personal convenience. Women, on the other hand, had no right to accuse their husbands. If a woman was raped, she had to prove she resisted. If she became pregnant, she was assumed complicit. The burden of proof always fell on the female. And in a culture where women had no legal voice, that proof was nearly impossible. Some women tried to fight back with poison, blackmail, or escape. But most simply endured. They learned to hide their thoughts, their desires, their pain, and over time, that silence became a kind of survival. Roman poets loved to write about adulterous women, usually with venom. They painted them as liars, temptresses, or fools. But buried between the lines was something else. Fear. Fear that a woman might choose for herself, that she might want more than duty, that she might be more than an object. So they built laws like cages and called it virtue. In ancient Rome, adultery wasn't about broken vows, it was about broken control. And for every woman who stepped outside her cage, there were 10 more forced back in. Not by love, not by justice, but by the sharp teeth of a world built to punish their freedom. In the Roman Empire, sex could be bought as easily as bread. Brothels lined the streets of every major city, their entrances marked with carved phalluses pointing the way. Behind those doors were women, men, and children, mostly slaves, whose bodies were not their own. They didn't sell themselves, they were sold. Some were born into bondage, others were captured in war, or sold by desperate families. Once inside a Roman brothel, they were stripped of their names, given crude nicknames, and priced by the hour. Payment was usually a single coin, cheap and forgettable. The experience was never meant to be human. For many Roman men, visiting brothels wasn't taboo, it was expected, a rite of passage, a place to boast about in the baths or write about in graffiti. Sex was not intimate, but mechanical, ritualized, and often violent. The people performing it were not seen as people at all, just instruments of pleasure, and the law protected that idea. Slaves had no legal identity, no ability to refuse. If they resisted, they could be whipped, starved, or killed without consequence. If they became pregnant, the child became the property of the brothel owner, another body to raise and eventually sell. Some were branded with hot irons, marked with symbols of ownership. Others were forced to perform in front of crowds for entertainment. These were called public pleasures, and the audience didn't hide. Senators, priests, even scholars attended. The stage became a place of humiliation. A slave's suffering became sport. Even the architecture of Roman cities reflected this cruelty. In Pompeii, erotic frescoes decorated the walls of brothels, cheerful images of smiling women, of passion, of variety. But the reality was silence, bruises, and exhaustion. Each fresco was a lie. Some tried to escape. Few succeeded. A handful were bought out by wealthy clients. Others found ways to resist silently, refusing to speak, scratching messages into walls, or helping each other survive in small, invisible ways. And yet, even outside the brothels, freedom did not mean safety. In elite Roman households, sexual servitude was expected of certain slaves. They were assigned to masters, guests, even children of the household. Their roles were clear: obey, perform, endure. To be a sexual object in ancient Rome was not a scandal. It was a job one enforced by chains, not choice. Rome dressed itself in marble and law, but beneath the surface, it was a market of flesh, a world where power meant access, and access meant violation. There were no safe words, no closed doors, no lines that couldn't be crossed, just bodies, bought, sold, and forgotten. And for every statue Rome raised to its gods, there were 1,000 hands in the dark that no one ever carved. In ancient Rome, sex was not always condemned by religion. In some corners of the empire, it was worshipped. There were temples where pleasure was prayer, where the body was not shamed but offered up to the divine. The contradiction was striking. A society that punished women for adultery also built altars to fertility goddesses and held festivals where decency collapsed. At the center of this were sacred rituals, some whispered, some sung aloud, that blurred the line between the spiritual and the erotic. The cult of Venus, goddess of love, was among the most popular. Her followers believed that beauty and desire were divine forces, not sins to be hidden. In some rites, sexual union was believed to bring worshippers closer to the gods. Some scholars point to the influence of older traditions from the Greeks, the Etruscans, and even the East, where temple prostitution was seen as a sacred duty. Women, sometimes called sacred companions, would engage in ritual intimacy with strangers in the name of fertility and divine blessing. These acts weren't seen as shameful. They were offerings, but not all Roman cults treated sex as gentle or symbolic. In the mystery cults, secretive religious sects that promised enlightenment, rebirth, or eternal life, sex was sometimes part of initiation. The rites of Bacchus, for example, were infamous for their secrecy and ecstasy. During the Bacchanalia, worshippers would drink wine until frenzy overtook them. Then, in the forests or hidden caves, the boundaries of self would dissolve in ritual madness. Naked bodies danced in the dark, moans mixed with music, and for the Romans who feared loss of control above all else, these cults were terrifying. Eventually, the Senate outlawed them, not just because of the sex, but because they could not be controlled. Yet at the same time, Rome maintained its obsession with the Vestal Virgins, priestesses of Vesta, who were sworn to 30 years of chastity. These women were revered as symbols of Rome's eternal flame, their virginity tied to the empire's fate. But if a Vestal broke her vow, she was not executed. That would anger the gods. Instead, she was buried alive. A silent tomb, a slow death, a warning to all. Rome was full of contradictions. One god demanded chastity, another welcomed ecstasy. One woman was punished for desire, another praised for surrendering to it. And in the middle stood a people who claimed to value order, but built a world full of chaos where sex could be sacred, sinful, or both, depending on who was watching. Religion in ancient Rome didn't silence desire, it sanctified it, and in doing so, gave it power not just over the body, but over the soul. The private lives of Roman emperors were anything but private. Behind the walls of the imperial palace, desire turned into spectacle, and power twisted into perversion. The emperor's bed was not a place of rest, it was a stage where the most dangerous performances took place. Whispers about what happened there spread through the empire like smoke. Caligula was said to have turned the palace into a brothel, forcing noble women to perform for guests, laughing as their husbands watched in silence. He supposedly slept with his sisters, paraded his lovers in front of the Senate, and declared himself both god and god of lust. But Caligula wasn't the only one who blurred the line between rule and ruin. Nero, his descendant in blood and madness, took it further. He married a young boy named Sporus, castrated him, dressed him in the robes of a Roman empress, and called him his wife. Later, Nero took another man as his husband, switching roles depending on the day. These weren't private affairs, they were deliberate acts of dominance, meant to shock, confuse, and control. In a world where sexual power reflected political power, nothing was more terrifying than a ruler who rewrote the rules of both. Emperors could humiliate senators by forcing them to watch orgies, or by taking their wives and returning them used. To defy the emperor in his bedchamber was to risk your life. Consent was irrelevant. Resistance was treason. The imperial bedroom became a weapon. Through sex, the emperor displayed his absolute control not just over Rome, but over the dignity of its most powerful men. Some victims were invited under the guise of dinner. Others were dragged from their homes in the middle of the night. Once inside the palace, the rules of law no longer applied. Only the emperor's appetite mattered. Writers like Suetonius recorded these acts with both horror and fascination. But beneath their scandalous details was a warning. When one man holds unchecked power, even the most sacred boundaries collapse. And yet, some of these stories may have been exaggerated, political poison turned into gossip. Enemies of the emperor had reasons to paint him as a monster. But even if only half the stories were true, they revealed a disturbing truth about Roman leadership. It wasn't just about armies and taxes. It was about fear, about performance, about showing that no one, not even the noblest citizen, was safe from the desires of one man. In ancient Rome, the emperor's body was the state, and when that body wanted something, the entire empire bent with it. The Roman Empire did not fall with a sword, but with a whisper, a rumor of what happened in the dark, between silk sheets and marble walls, where pleasure became power, and no one left untouched. In ancient Rome, you didn't need to enter a brothel to be surrounded by sex. It was already there, carved into walls, painted above doorways, scratched into tavern benches, and scrawled across the city in crude poetry. The streets themselves whispered the obscene. Pompeii, buried and preserved by volcanic ash, became a time capsule of Roman lust. On nearly every wall, there were phallic symbols pointing the way to brothels, or simply serving as symbols of luck and masculinity. But these weren't hidden away. They were proudly displayed on bakeries, bathhouses, and even homes. Inside, frescoes showed men and women in positions that modern censors would blur. Some walls even offered menus, a painted catalog of acts and prices. But this wasn't pornography in the modern sense. It was casual, expected, ordinary. The Romans were not embarrassed by nudity or desire. They mocked restraint. Even the language of the empire was soaked in innuendo. Graffiti filled with vulgar jokes covered public toilets, bathhouse walls, and stairwells. "I screwed the barmaid," one carving reads. Another brags, quote, "Celadus the gladiator makes the girls moan." These weren't hidden declarations, they were public trophies. Scholars today walk through Pompeii's ruins and find hundreds of such messages, scratched by ordinary people into stone as casually as someone today might leave a review. Erotic art also appeared in unexpected places. Oil lamps shaped like genitals, statues of gods caught in the act, garden fountains adorned with suggestive figures. Even children's toys and amulets sometimes carried erotic symbols not for shock, but for protection. The image of a phallus was believed to ward off evil, bring luck, and guard against misfortune. To the Romans, the obscene was sacred. But not everyone shared this openness. As the empire grew older and Christianity crept into its borders, shame began to spread. The same images that once brought laughter and power were now seen as sinful. Walls were painted over, statues were buried, temples were closed. But the past has a way of surviving. Centuries later, when archaeologists began unearthing Pompeii, they were stunned by what they found. At first, they locked the most explicit artifacts in secret museums, allowing only mature scholars to view them. The truth was too raw, too real, too revealing. Because what the ruins made clear was this: the Romans didn't separate the sacred from the sexual. They lived in a world where desire was public, laughter was lewd, and shame had not yet been invented. In the end, the most revealing thing about Rome wasn't its emperors or battles, it was its walls. They told the truth no history book dared to write. That in ancient Rome, sex wasn't whispered, it was shouted, painted, carved in stone, and that stone still speaks. As the centuries passed and Rome began to crack beneath its own weight, so too did its appetite for pleasure. What was once carved proudly into stone was now seen as filth. Statues that once stood tall in gardens were buried or beheaded. Murals were painted over, brothels were shuttered, their names scratched out, their histories rewritten. Something colder was moving through the empire, not a sword, but a silence. The rise of Christianity brought with it a new kind of power, one that did not tolerate the Roman obsession with the body. Lust became sin, virginity became sainthood. The gods of wine and love were cast out in favor of a single god who demanded control, restraint, and moral purity. And the empire obeyed not all at once, but inch by inch, church by church. Desire, once public, was driven underground. The same emperors who had paraded their lovers now prayed for forgiveness on their deathbeds. Priests replaced poets, shame replaced satire. The Lex Julia, once designed to punish female adultery, was now reinterpreted to punish all sex outside of marriage. Celibacy was glorified, bodies were covered. The flesh, once celebrated, was treated as a weakness, a temptation to be conquered. The laughter faded from the bathhouses. The festivals that once honored Venus and Bacchus turned into whispered memories, then into heresy. The women who had danced in temples now lit candles in silence. And the men who once carved their conquests into stone now scratched crosses into catacombs. But even as the new religion tried to smother Rome's past, it could not erase it. The ruins remembered. Beneath churches, archaeologists would later find frescoes of lovers still entwined. In the corners of old villas, mosaics still glistened with forbidden scenes. Rome had changed its laws, its gods, its morals, but the stones had already spoken, and they could not be unspoken. The shift was not just cultural, it was psychological. A society that once defined itself through dominance and sexual power now defined itself through guilt, denial, and suppression. But repression did not cleanse, it buried. And what is buried does not disappear, it festers. For every vow of chastity, there was a scandal hidden behind monastery walls. For every moral sermon, there was a transaction made in shadowed alleys. The new Rome still wanted what the old Rome had taught it to crave it, just no longer had the words for it. And so, the cycle continued. In the end, the fall of Roman lust did not come with fire or plague. It came with silence. A silence enforced by law, wrapped in scripture, and preached from marble altars. But beneath the silence, the echoes remained of laughter in the bathhouses, of footsteps in the brothel halls, of stone hands reaching for flesh that time could never fully erase. Rome may have buried its desire, but desire remembers, always. If this glimpse into Rome's forbidden past left you questioning what else history tried to bury, you're not alone. There are more stories carved in silence, and we're here to uncover them. Subscribe to Forgotten Stories, Ancient World for more hidden truths, erased rituals, and the dark side of civilizations we thought we knew. And if you want more tales that history books were too afraid to print, like this video, leave a comment, and we'll keep digging.